The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1968 but came into force in March 1970. This treaty attempted to freeze the number of countries that had developed nuclear weapons to only the United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China. Under this treaty, the five countries agreed to not export nuclear weapons or technology to non-nuclear holding countries. This treaty also supported the development of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. By the mid-1980s, over 120 countries had signed this treaty, including the United States. In April of the same year, President Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia and sent troops. This marked the beginning of the end of the Vietnam War. Nixon wanted to free the United States from the war, but he did not want to make it seem like he was giving in to communist pressure. His national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, sought to end the war diplomatically by using the improved relationship between the United States and Soviet Union. Kissinger looked at the idea of using Soviet pressure and influence on the North Vietnamese to settle the war peacefully. To give South Vietnamese troops more time to regroup from battles, North Vietnamese pressure needed to be lessened. Knowing that much of the North Vietnamese military activity was launched in eastern Cambodia, Nixon thought of attacking this source. At this point of the war, the U.S. and South Vietnam was not looking like they were going to win anytime soon. After sending in troops, Nixon was heavily criticized by Americans for escalating war, but the invasion did create some setbacks on the North Vietnamese. 2 years later, the Strategic Arms Limitations Talk, also known as SALT, began in the late 1960s but made its effect in 1972. These talks specifically aimed to limit and reduce the U.S. and Soviet nuclear arsenals. The talks between President Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev eventually led into the development of several new agreements: Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Accident Measures Agreement, and Interim Agreement, all regarding weapon control. Finally, on January 22, 1973, President Nixon announced a ceasefire agreement had been signed in Paris. This would allow United States troops to withdraw. Achieving this ceasefire agreement was difficult for the U.S., though. By the time Nixon came into office, the Vietnam War was a moral issue of whether or not to be involved in an internal conflict between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Of course, the attempt of Vietnamization, a mission to get U.S. troops out of Vietnam, involved the invasion of Cambodia. Another method in achieving Vietnamization was having the South Vietnamese army invade Laos and cut off supplies to the communists in the South as peace talks were going on between Henry Kissinger, the U.S. representative, and Le Du Toc, the North Vietnamese representative. The two reached a secret agreement, but South Vietnam did not accept it, so North Vietnam angrily broke it off. Wanting this negotiation badly, Nixon threatened North Vietnam by launching a massive bombing campaign. This brought Le Du Toc back to the negotiation, and eventually the two representatives were able to agree on peace terms. Fast forward 6 years, in July 1979, SALT II Treaty was signed between President Carter and the Soviet Union. Talks of the SALT II Treaty began right after SALT I in November of 1972. The initial goal of the new treaty focused on meeting the terms specified in the interim agreement regarding strategic weapons. The talk continued over the next several years until a new goal was set to specifically limit the number of certain offensive weapons each side could have. Although SALT II was never ratified by the Senate due to the failure of Carter to achieve domestic support of it and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the terms were followed by both nations throughout the 1980s. In the following year, President Carter issued the Carter Doctrine in July of 1980 in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. According to the doctrine, Carter states, an attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. The Carter Doctrine was a containment strategy that will directly apply to other events in the future, such as the Soviet expansion to the Persian Gulf and Southwest Asia area. 2 years later, in April of 1982, the United States became involved in the Falkland War, a war on a British colony between Britain and Argentina. The United Nations condemned Argentina's aggression and demanded that they withdraw from the Falkland Islands. In fear, the United States sided with Great Britain, thinking that the Soviet Union would side with Argentina. This meant that the Soviet Union could potentially attempt to spread communism to South America, a place that was considered the backyard of the United States. In that same year, in June, Ronald Reagan announces in a speech before a joint session parliament that he challenges the Soviet Union to engage in ideological warfare with the United States, essentially a war based on whose ideas are better. Reagan wanted to assert that the Western constitutional democracy was a superior moral form of government. His speech attacked a totalitarian government and advocated for the adoption of a constitutional democracy instead. In the following year, President Ronald Reagan ordered the invasion of Grenada, a small Caribbean island nation that took place from October 25th to November 2nd, 1983. He insisted that the nation was necessary to protect the lives of several hundred Americans living there from Grenada's coup leaders. Reagan claimed that these coup leaders were allied with the communist Cuba and that Cuba and the Soviet Union was seeking political dominance over the island. In the invasion, 19 American troops, 45 Grenadans, and at least 24 Cuban nationals were killed in the attack or later died due to severe injuries. Although the Cuban government insisted that the Cubans killed were civilian construction workers, U.S. troops insisted that they were combat troops. Following the invasion, Reagan declared that it had helped end America's post-Vietnam War period of self-doubt in military matters. Skipping forward 5 years, on May 27, 1988, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, also known as the INF Treaty, was ratified by the U.S. Senate. The INF Treaty was an agreement between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev to eliminate their intermediate nuclear forces in Europe. In November of 1983, the United States had deployed INF missiles in Europe, which made the Soviets withdraw from the INF Strategic Arms Reduction talks and Mutual Balance Force Reductions negotiations. Tensions between the United States and Soviet Union continued to rise within the arguments of armed forces and weapons, such as the difference over the Strategic Arms Control Agreement. Towards the late 1980s, a successful chain of events between the two rival nations marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War, including the agreement to eliminate intermediate nuclear forces in Europe.